Good morning.
Good morning.
Better than that. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. I still think I can do better. I'll with that. We're in 1 Peter chapter 3. We're getting to go into a new chapter here in Peter, page 982 in your Pew Bibles. If you didn't bring yours, please turn there. Peter continues to talk about our relationships with each other and in an unbelieving world, of what our Christian walk should be like, and where it should be. You know, he's been writing to the scattered Christians in Asia underneath the persecution of Nero. We've talked about that a little bit, but we talked about though how Peter, you know, when he first he was being more theological, and now he's really turned into being more personal in our walk. So, and you get to this passage, and I've entitled "How to Have a Godly Marriage." It is talking about wives and husbands. I will say I'm not an expert. Never will I ever be an expert. You know, about a godly marriage. I try to be the best godly husband I can, but I can guarantee I'm not. So, we're in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. So if you will, please stand as I read God's word. In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives. As they observe your chaste and respectful behavior, your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in the former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. Just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. Your husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. Please pray with me. Lord Heavenly Father, just once again, I just thank you for everything you do. Lord, I pray that your words would be spoken here. God, that I can just get out of your way, because I know you're the only reason why I can stand up here and do this. It's only through your strength that I have this ability. Lord, thank you for what you do. In Jesus Christ's name I pray. Amen. You may be seated. Do you know why the king of hearts and queen of hearts married each other? They were perfectly suited for each other. Two antennas met on a roof. They fell in love and got married. The ceremony wasn't much, but the reception was great. So what did Cinderella say when her photos didn't show up? Maybe one day my prince will be here. My prince will come. Dad jokes are great. I don't care what you say. It gives me a thumb up. I thought they were funny. You know, I really did. You know what, guys? Second to our relationship with God, marriage is the most single important relationship you will ever have. It's also, I believe, one of the holiest things a person can ever do. Marriage is about living in harmony, commonality, and agreement. I think it's hard enough being two born again Christians, but then being in a marriage with somebody who's not born again. I just really think there's something special about two Christians coming together as one. God being in the center of the marriage. I really believe that's being special. I look at marriages as going like a high priest into the Holy of Holies. I believe that you should look at a marriage with reverence and fear and trepidation. Fully understand the consequences of failure. Man, what Peter is describing here is directly addressing those who've been born again and a desire to be married. God you know, he instituted marriage, and I believe one of the reasons why he instituted this marriage is to show the human being the kind of relationship he wants to have with each and every single one of us. I mean, you can kind of relate to that relationship of God with us in a marriage. In the Old Testament, the word marriage describes God's spiritual relationship with his children, Israel, and how that sin would come into that relationship, and it would be idolatry and adultery. You know, we look at Hosea in the Old Testament, right? And Hosea was told by God to go look up Gomer, who was a prostitute, and marry her and have kids, and then she was, excuse me, and how she was unfaithful with that. And so we see, and then how Hosea went and brought her back. You know, God pictures that sin in our life as adultery to him. In the New Testament, it kind of continues as it talks about Christ being the bridegroom and the church being his bride, and that together. Peter has explained that we as believers, starting in chapter 2, that we need to live in a manner that is above reproach to an unbelieving world. Man, he talks about having us being subjects of authority of the people above us, as whether it's citizens to government, parents or children to parents, or slaves to masters. Peter says that there's no authority, and anarchy will prevail. That it just be chaos. And as Christians, that we should not rebel against authority, but work within the system. These verses, Peter really, he's talking about godly living, but he talks about husbands and wives, and how I can believe as going through these we can have a godly marriage. So let's dig into the scriptures here. In verses 1 and 2, it says, in the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be warned without a word of the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. You know, Peter uses a word here that's different than when he's talking about slaves being submissive to their masters. He uses the word homosis, which is H-U-M-O-S-I-O-S. And the word he used on the other one was kathos, K-A-T-H-O-S. And that word he used from slave to master is that somebody who has a supreme authority over top of somebody else. The slave has to be submissive. The slave has to go do what the master tells him. I mean, it's a difference of that. The word that Peter uses here is different. This word that Peter uses is about a loving, caring, submissive way. Okay? And it's not as a slave owner to slave, but as something that is loving, caring, so that the wives should have a positive attitude when it comes to their husbands and being submissive underneath their husbands. You know, Christian wives were to accept the authority of husbands in obedience to Christ. Really to keep harmony in the family and to encourage unbelieving husbands. Man, submission to wife being submissive to a husband is one of those subjects that's not really popular to preach. It's not really a popular subject at all. It is taught throughout the New Testament in Galatians chapter 3, Ephesians chapter 5. You know, and it's really misunderstood. When I was in the youth, teaching the youth, and we came across this subject of wives being submissive to husbands, I had several of the female, of the girls that was in there that said, I'll never be submissive to my husband. And I said, well, you know, it's biblical, and then you'll never be a biblical wife if you're not. It's just not a popular subject. These texts, see, what's the misunderstanding when you get these texts is that this does not teach general subjugation of women underneath. This does not teach women being doormats to men. That's not what these scriptures teach, okay? It's actually when a husband and wife come together as Christians, that they should respect God-given authority of their husband, because God set up the family as the man being the spiritual and physical leader of the household, with the wives underneath the husbands. Okay? It is that the reason why the wives are submissive to the husbands is because that the husband loved Christ the way Christ loved the church. And I think of that way, and I think it's just really misunderstood of this. I believe that marriage and family relationships, I believe for them to run smoothly, to be the way it is, that God, instead of the family being in chaos, that He has an order of the way the family should be ran. It does not mean that a submissive wife is just obedient in some blind obedience or in being inferior. Now, I think a wife who accepts her husband's authority is accepting the relationship that God has designed to give the husband the leadership and responsibility. Man, I believe that when one partner believes, but when we go, let's change gears here, and as Peter's talking about, one who believes, a wife who is a Christian, who believes, who accepted Christ as Lord and Savior, and the husband is not. Okay, Peter he's talking about that here, and what he is saying is that you need that wife could be a witness, living that way. Back in these days, these days in the Bible are much different than the days that we are here. Because wives, husband had authority over the whole household, no matter what, and everything he owned was like his property. But when a man became a Christian, he usually would bring his whole family to church. Look at the Philippian jailer who became a Christian when Peter and Paul was in prison, and his whole family came to know Christ. Look at Cornelius, when Peter went to Cornelius and realized that it was for the Samaritan, for not the Jews, the Samaritans anyway. And we see that Cornelius' whole family came to know Christ, not just Cornelius. But when a woman became a Christian, in those days she usually came to church alone. Okay? Under Roman law, the husband and father had absolute authority over all members of the household. So a wife who would demand her freedoms as a Christian could endanger her marriage and maybe even her life if her husband disapproved of that. Instead, she would live her new faith, as Peter says, quietly and respectfully. You know, that's the way that she should live her faith. Because when Christian women would go in, Peter says that you could win them over without even saying a word. I believe that wholeheartedly, that we can win people over just by our lifestyle, how we live and what we do. That we don't have to preach to people. Peter's saying, don't go back in there and preaching to them. Just live your life as a Christian. Be submissive to Him as you're called to be submissive. I believe that Christian women, lives should reflect both purity and reverence. And I think that could really, when you do that type of things, you're going to be pleasing your husband and you're going to be submissive to them. At the very least, when you do that, men would allow their wives to continue practicing their religion. And maybe somewhere along the line, that they're coming to Christ. So verses 3 through 6, Peter kind of addresses this a little bit in a different way. He says, your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses, but let it be a hidden person of the heart with an imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, the former times, the holy women also who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands. Just like Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him Lord, you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. So Peter, as he's writing directly to these Christian wives, he's saying that listen, you need to understand something. I know you want to be attractive. I believe that's the case today, that he's right. I know you want to be attractive, but quit focusing on the outward. You know, quit focusing on that to make yourself attractive. You know, the world today says what? That you're only as good as the way you look on the outside. I mean, you see commercials about staying young. You see commercials about losing weight. You see commercials about dressing a certain way and doing certain things. Now, I cannot fathom the pressure that a young lady has in high school, right out of high school, of having to dress a certain way to be in the cool group, be in that clique, you know, or saying the right things or doing the right thing. You have to wear things, certain clothes, and do all this. I think there's a lot of pressure on women to look and act a certain way by the world standard. And Peter is saying, don't worry about that. He says, take care of yourself. But it's not the outside that counts. It's the inside that matters. It doesn't matter really what your outside. We've all seen people who's been attractive, whether a man or a woman, you know, look really nice, but on the outside, but just been really ugly on the inside. I mean, we've all seen people like that. You know, they think they're better than anybody else, or their attitude. So that Peter says that's not the way Christian wives should be. Yes, take care of yourself. Let your inside, your inner beauty, what's on the inside, show. That's where true beauty is. Because let me tell you what, your hair is going to gray. Or in my case, you're going to lose it. Jewelry will tarnish. Clothes will go out of style. You're going to grow old. And that beauty that you had, or you thought you had, it's not going to be there when you get up. But you want to have a lasting beauty? You want to have something that really makes you beautiful? Then look on your inside. Because that's what really makes you beautiful. When you live a Christian life. When you live the way you're supposed to live. Because that inner beauty, the attitudes, the thoughts, the motivations, they're really revealed in your word and your actions. And that inner self, and we've been transformed by the Holy Spirit. We should really let that shine through. Man, Peter tells us that the holy women of the past were not only holy and beautiful, not because they lived perfect lives or had perfect looks, because they had a hope in God. Then Proverbs 31:30 says, charm is deceptive, beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. And I really believe that. I mean, the women back in biblical days, they knew how to trust God, how to submit to that authority. You know, and Peter is saying that inside, you know, he used Sarah as an example. She was a submissive to Abraham. She called him Lord. But she wasn't a doormat by any stretch of the imagination, because if you read that story, she insisted on Hagar and Ishmael being removed from the family. Abraham really didn't want to do that because that was his son. But what did Abraham do? He dismissed him out of the family, right? Why? Because Sarah wanted it. She was submissive to him. Don't think that she wasn't. And Peter says, for those who do what God calls them to do, who has that trust, that hope, that faith in God, they are children of Sarah. The way Sarah was submissive and what she was, that women who do that, you should not have to fear your husband because of who God is. And that's how you should live. So Peter's calling upon Christian wives to do what is good and never let fears alarm them. Because the Christians want this faith that's in God. That's who they have to hope in. So Peter uses like 5 verses to talk about women. And he comes back with 1 verse talking about men and husbands, okay? So I would skip this, but I don't think it'd quite be right if I did. But verse 7 says, your husbands is the same way. Live with your wives in an understanding way as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. Just as wives are to be submissive and accept that authority, as husbands, we need to understand and be considerate to our wives. That's the bottom line. That's what Peter says. I believe it's more than just a kind attitude, okay? I think it implies consideration of wives based on knowledge of their needs, their desires, their gifts, their abilities. A husband who acts on his knowledge of his wife will greatly enrich both lives, hers and their own. And Peter says that the husband should respect his wife as a weaker partner. Now, let me explain. I will. I'm not going to just call that out there and go on. This is not about a spiritual weakness. is about a man being stronger, which is well documented than a woman. So when he talks about the weaker, he's talking about a man being physically stronger than a woman, not spiritually. Okay, Peter did not use this term to diminish women, but to build a case for respecting them. Because with being a weaker partner, a husband should protect and honor and help his wife. Okay, that's where Peter's going with this. He will stay with her, respect her opinions, listen to her advice, be considerate to her needs, relate to her both privately and publicly with love, courtesy, insight, and tact. You know, Ephesians 5:25 tells the husbands to honor your wife just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. So as husbands, we should be that way to our wives. We should honor our wives and love our wives the same as Christ loved the church. He gave his life for the church. And as husbands, being a Christian husband, we should do the same thing for our wives. But what husbands need to understand is that we're not to walk in front. In God's eyes, we're the same. In God's eyes, that gracious gift that he has given us through his Son, Jesus Christ, puts us on equal standing in God's eyes. That plan of salvation, what we got through Christ as men, is the same as what women got through Christ. It is exactly the same. When God looks down, he doesn't see us above them in the chain of salvation. Our salvation is equal. It is exactly the same. You know, that's why Peter, when he says there in verse 7 at the very end, a fellow heir of the grace of life. So we have to understand that we are equal, both men and women who are believers are heirs of that gracious gift of eternal life. And we can have that same relationship with God. So as I've gone through this and I've talked about that, and I want to talk about marriages for a little bit, because I really believe there's really three things I think a godly marriage has that we really need. And I know there's probably more than this, but I really think that these three things are prevalent in a godly marriage. So the first thing is, so we can have a godly marriage by putting God first. Putting God first. You know, when I first became youth pastor here at the Bridge, I was working full time. Just had a kid, graduated high school, was in college, playing college baseball. Had a daughter who was still in high school, doing all the high school things and with being busy with that. I was still heavily involved in sports, playing sports, you know, and I'm sitting there trying to think about how am I juggling all this. And so, kind of feel a little bit overwhelmed. I turned to one of my best friends, a guy named George Sanders, to mentor me. And we would meet for breakfast and once a week, and we would talk about things. And as I was kind of getting a little overwhelmed, I asked him, I was like, you know I'm supposed to put God first in my life, but what really comes second is in my family. I mean, church is important. Well, where's my job fit in there? You know, I've got all these other things going on. Where does everything fit in? And George just kind of smiles at me and says, put God first. I said, well, I don't understand that. I know God should be first, and I really try to make God first, you know, with him being first. I'm growing in my ministry, but still, what got 2, 3, and 4? George, give me an idea. He just smiles at me again. He says, just put God first. 2, 3, and 4 take care of itself. He's exactly right. When we put God first, everything else will come in its place. Because my relationship with God is the most important thing in my life. And when I got my relationship right with God, then all my relationships around me are going to be right. When I'm failing in my relationships, with my wife, people at work, my mom, people here at church, when I'm failing in those relationships, it takes me a little bit, but I realize I'm failing in my relationship with God. Because of the direct result of how I relate to other people is how I have that relationship with God. And I really believe that that's the truth. I think that too many people today don't put God first in their life, or even in their marriages. I mean, people as Christians, that they come to church, they got their jobs first, their families first, their hobbies first, whatever the case may be. There's so many other things that take the place of God being first in their life. You know, Jesus, Matthew 6:24, tells us that no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. And Jesus is talking about money, of course, but I'm looking at it at the world. You can't have one foot in the world and one foot, on God. It's either you're going to be with God or you're going to be in the world. He says if you try to serve us both, you're going to have a loyalty to one or the other. Because you cannot serve both equally. It just doesn't happen. It's either you're going to serve me or you're going to serve in the world. And you can't have two masters. You got to put me first, is what he says. Because you go read down a little bit further, and you get in verse 33 here in chapter 6, he says, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Seek first his kingdom. And that's when it comes to our marriages. That's when it comes to things in our life. Seek first his kingdom, and everything else is going to be given to you. His righteousness. I mean, that settles the question of our priorities in our life. It's God's first in our marriage. And one of the things I say in counseling, when I'm counseling some of these younger kids, is that our life is like a triangle. God's at the top, and we're on the sides. And the closer we get to God, the closer you're going to get to each other. God's first in our marriage. You know, a lot of times as young couples do, just two people, you want to think, well, okay, we'll just hold hands with God, Christ, and you hold hands with each other. But then as your family grows, it means Christ is going to get farther out. Christ should always be in the center of your life and of your marriage. And when God is the center of your marriage, you're going to have a godly marriage. Okay, it's just that simple. So the second thing I want us to see is when we can have a godly marriage by communicating with each other. Communicating with each other. I'm going to go on record that I fail miserably at this. Okay, I really do. I don't communicate the way I get closed up, and I don't know. I just don't do. I fail at this. Okay, very badly. Communication can be a source of disappointment or a source of joy in a marriage. A lack of communication, I really believe, causes a husband and wife to drift apart. Poor communication leads to misunderstandings, and misunderstandings can lead to serious conflicts and hurts. But on the other hand, if you have good and regular communication, you can build a strong and intimate relationship, marriage. You're going to resolve conflicts before they even start getting too big, because you're able to communicate with each other. I believe that communication involves more than just conversation. Communication is to get to know the other person and to talk and be intimate when you're talking about your conversation. James 1:19 it's just a perfect example of the way we need to communicate to each other. It says, this you know, my beloved brethren, but everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Must be quick to hear. When he says that, this is an active listening. This is just not, okay, and then go on. No, it is actively listening, hearing what your spouse has to say, what your partner has to say. And you need to be attentive when you're listening. The next thing is, to me, it's a different side of the same coin, is to be slow to speak. Understand. We're told to always be full of grace and full of salt. Should be uplifting. I believe within every successful marriage is an emotionally intelligent husband who shares power in decision making with his wife and knows how to find a common ground. The sense of equality within a marriage is a critical predicator of happiness in a marriage. It's been shown that marriages, even before a couple gets together, if they're in conflict, if they are tearing each other down, if they're talking to run their marriage down, communication is key in a godly marriage. It's something that you have to have, because I believe you cannot have a relationship that grows without having positive communication with each other. So the next thing I want us to see is when we can have a godly marriage by carrying each other's burdens. Carrying each other's burdens. And life is difficult, isn't it? It is full of burdens, and it is difficult. Galatians 6:2 says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. The NIV says, carry each other's burdens. So we are to bear or carry each other's burdens. As Christians, as a whole, we have been given a responsibility to restore the broken and to relieve the burden. The assumption behind this task is that we all have burdens that God does not want us to carry alone. He wants us to help other people. The word carry means to remove or lift an overwhelming load off of someone. Okay, it means to come alongside somebody, to take that load, put it on your shoulders, and walk down that highway with them and to help them through whatever they're going through. Man, this could be sicknesses, a sudden tragedy, a personal loss, maybe a financial difficulty, broken dreams, a failed marriage, family problems, career setbacks, maybe a death of a loved one. But what is significant about that, when Paul says carry each other's burdens, he doesn't say, or doesn't give us the burden. He just tells us to do what? To carry that burden. Whatever that burden is. It doesn't matter what burden or where it comes from. What matters, if you see a brother or sister staggering, if you see someone who's under a heavy load, we need to drop and go help them. You know, once again, we just got through studying James, which was a great book to go through. And James says, what good is it if you see a brother who's hungry, if you see a brother that needs clothing, and you say, hey, just go on. God bless you. I'll be praying for you. Your faith is really worthless. You need to go help that brother. You need to clothe that brother. You need to feed that brother. That's what he tells us. You know, and Peter tells us right here, when we do that, we're fulfilling the law of Christ. That's what we're doing. We're fulfilling the law of Christ. John sums it up here in John 13:34. He says, a new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. So, you know, we're told to love one another. Man, when we see somebody rocked in this life that is having a difficulty, we need to, whatever the case may be, go help that person. I just wonder, though, if we're called to carry other people's burdens, shouldn't we be really concerned about carrying our spouse's burdens? One of the things I say when I counsel couples for marriage is that what they had before their marriage is no longer theirs when they are married. So whatever bills, whatever sickness, whatever money you have now belongs to the other person. It is not yours any longer. It is your spouse's. Whatever that case may be. So whatever, when you get married, there's no such thing that this is yours and this is hers. That old saying, when women say what's mine is mine, what yours is mine, that doesn't go. It's not that way. It's whatever the one person has is now the other person's. And so if there's a burden to be bared, then that falls squarely on your spouse also. I truly believe that with all my heart, that if we have burdens to bear, your spouse must be bearing it 100% all of too, because marriage is 100% both ways. And you have to bear those burdens. So to wrap up, the unspoken reality is that marriage at its best is a struggle. It is. It is hard. It can take a lifetime for two people to mold into one. It takes 100% effort from both to make a marriage work. You cannot overcome or compensate for one of them not giving 100%. I believe God must must be at the center of a person's life and not their spouses. I think that loving our spouse is a natural result of loving God with all our hearts, minds, soul, and strength. This is the truth. I believe that there is no perfect marriage. And I hear people say, well, we never argue. I just laugh. Because I know there's no such thing as a perfect marriage. If it is, please give me the recipe to have that perfect marriage. Because I don't have one. But man, I believe we can have such a godly marriage by uniting three persons: a man, a woman, and God. I believe that's what makes a marriage holy. I believe that's what God instituted for us to have. Man, I believe that when we have this godly marriage, we're going to communicate with each other. We're going to carry each other's burdens. Marriage is hard, but it's the greatest relationship you will ever have outside the relationship